Okay, well, good morning. I have Steve Blair with us this morning and Ralph Paffenbarger, and thank you so much for coming by. And one of the things we're trying to do is just chat with some leaders in the field about your respective careers and how you got involved in ACSM, and in particular for you two, a little bit about your early research in epidemiology studies and physical activity, and how this physical activity has moved more and more into the realm of public health issues, things like that. So we're really looking at it as a little chat this morning, and so feel free to go in any direction you choose.
Okay.
So, Paff, I guess we could start with you. And where did you get your degrees, and what was your early research and that type of thing, and how did you get involved in physical activity?
Well, I graduated from Ohio State University. I'm a strong proponent of the Buckeyes. I think they could even beat the Kansas Jayhawks. I'm not sure.
Any day, probably.
I went to medical school after my mother stopped taking care of me. I went to Northwestern University in Chicago, and there I got interested in infectious disease epidemiology. My interest first was in poliomyelitis, and Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin came along, and there wasn't a whole lot that I could do.
After that, you had to find a new field.
That's right, and I did. I let the system change from an open to a closed system. Well, I'll have to explain what that means.
Before you do, I'm going to interrupt, though, and say that the work that Dr. Paffenbarger did with his mentor, Dr. Bodian from Hopkins, laid the groundwork. Salk and Sabin probably wouldn't have been successful, or at least at the time they were, had it not been for the fundamental epidemiology work that Paff and Dr. Bodian did.
And that was at Hopkins?
That was at Johns Hopkins.
Was that a postdoc or what?
Well, I know I was
Residency
assigned there from, by that time, I was in the Communicable Disease Center, and I was assigned up to Hopkins, and I got spent two years there, got a advanced degree, and let's see, what did I do next? Then I had some family troubles, and I got involved in the first chronic diseases that I've been involved in. Studied mental illnesses associated with pregnancy and with the postpartum period, and wrote a paper on the picture puzzle of the postpartum psychosis.
And again, the people in ACSM mostly would have no idea that Dr. Paffenbarger did fundamental work in this area of postpartum depression 50 years ago, 60 years ago, long time back.
Yeah, long time back, yeah. Well, let's see, where did I go next? Where did I meet you first? In South Carolina?
Well, I was at the University of South Carolina, and I think we met first at a Council on Epidemiology meeting of the American Heart. Sometime in the 70s, probably, when you were beginning to report your findings from the San Francisco longshoreman study. I know we spent time there in the early 70s, and I remember running with you in a motel parking lot in Tampa about that time, and I think that was the time you presented one of your major papers from the longshoreman study. So sometime in the early 70s, I think we met.
Okay.
Were you both in ACSM at that time, Steve? Or?
I was. I went as a very young person at the University of South Carolina. My second or third year there, I went to ACSM for the first time. At that time, you had to be recommended by someone to even get into ACSM.
Okay.
And I met a fellow who was at Duke and was a member, and he volunteered to nominate me, as it were, to be a member. So my first meeting was the ACSM meeting in Atlanta, and I think that was 1968. Could possibly have been 69. But that was my first meeting, and I've attended every one since then except one in, I think it was in Toronto in probably the early 70s.
Terry Kavanaugh's area.
Yeah. And then as long as we're talking about getting into ACSM, justified or not, I'm going to take credit for getting Dr. Paffenbarger coming to ACSM. Because by then, by the late 70s, and then I spent time at Stanford on a sabbatical leave and became friends with Dr. Paffenbarger. And then sometime, probably in your first meeting might have been 1980, 81, something like that.
Could have been.
But I said, you really need to come to this meeting. You'll enjoy it, and come and present your work because ACSM will greatly benefit from hearing your story. And I think the first one was Nashville.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the year Jerry Morris got the honor award.
That's right. I was
which
there.
was another attraction for us to go.
We're very much alike in that we both have handsome, affectionate, helpful wives.
We both married above our station. I think
Yeah, boy, I'll say we did. And we're both the same in that neither one of us has any hair up here.
I think you have more than Steve.
Everybody's got more than me.
He does a better job of raising a beard. Oh, yes, well, where else are we different? Where else have we? I'll tell you something very important. You and Ilka Vuori taught me how to teach epidemiology. I had never been, I'd never had to organize a course. I'd never had to really give a formal lecture to students until you came to Stanford, the two of you. And I'm very grateful for that, you know.
It was a great honor for me.
I want to go back and explain the difference between a closed and an open system.
Okay.
A closed system is like an enteric disease where infectious agent goes in and comes out as an enteric illness. Poliomyelitis is what I was interested in. Mm-hmm. And a closed system is where everything is interior. The blood is all within us. So I don't know what the point was that we were making when we started that. But at any rate,
you shifted your work from the open system to the closed system by moving from poliomyelitis to chronic disease.
Chronic disease, yes.
What about, now were you always when did you get interested in the physical activity? I assume it was maybe the longshoreman study was one of the earliest research studies.
For me? Yeah. Oh, yes. Again, Dr. Morris's work from London, and then Dr. Paffenbarger's work, and I had met Paff long before I met Jerry, so we've had a closer relationship. But yes, these the fundamental studies that founded the field of the epidemiology of physical activity and health.
Buses and
the buses and the longshoremen, and then Paff followed closely with the college alumni studies with alumna from Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania. And the fascinating thing about Paff's work, he had on the one hand the Harvard graduates who were all men of mid to upper socioeconomic strata, and
affluent.
then affluent men. And then the longshoremen, who were blue-collar workers, and but he found the same pattern of association, although the energy expenditure levels were very much different as a group in the longshoremen than they were in the Harvard alumni, but found similar results, which I've always found fascinating.
We haven't talked about the ACLS. I think you were involved in that.
I believe I've spent a few years
What is that?
as the Aerobic Center longitudinal study, which has kept me amused for 26, 27 years.
As a matter of fact, when did you go to Cooper Institute?
Well, again, Dr. Paffenbarger takes the credit or the blame for that. I was at Stanford on a sabbatical from '78 to 1980, and Dr. Paffenbarger had been serving on the scientific advisory board for the Cooper Institute. The epidemiologist that had been there for a few years left, so they were looking for a replacement. And he was kind enough to recommend to Dr. Cooper that they might consider me, which was
a Kansas farm boy.
Kansas farm boy, which was a great leap of faith on his, because I really have no training in epidemiology other than my association with the world's best. And I learned from that class that he claims I helped teach. So PAF recommended me, and Dr. Cooper made an offer for me to come. I felt obligated to go back to the University of South Carolina School of Public Health because they supported me during my sabbatical. So I made the counteroffer that I would work half-time on research at the Cooper Institute, and I commuted to Dallas a couple of times a month and spent several days a month there. And that's how I got involved with the Aerobic Center longitudinal study, which is a follow-up of the patients who've been examined at the Cooper Clinic, where they get a very thorough preventive medical examination. Each physician there sees 3 patients a day. So that tells you the meticulous nature of the exam and the amount of time taken. And what really attracted me, and with PAF's advice and guidance, was the fact that all these people had completed a maximal exercise test on a treadmill.
So you had the data.
We had the data on fitness, and we had the other clinical data measured in the laboratory, which I thought, and I believe PAF thought, would enable us to do some other things than he and Dr. Morris had been able to do using physical activity questionnaires and the like. Gave another approach, another perspective on sedentary lifestyle and disease. So I got started there in 1980, and again, PAF was very instrumental, continued on our scientific advisory board, and I followed along and copied a lot of the things that he had done with the Harvard alumni study. For example, mail back questionnaires every few years, and we just stole, if you will, his ideas and approaches and even some of the questions. And again, he was a mentor and advisor through that period, and indeed helped put my broken English into fluent prose so we might get some papers accepted on this work. And we've published a number of papers together. This man's writing is an outstanding record, scientific publications, but his writing is nearly poetic. I mean, it's not only clear and excellent work, it's poetic. And the younger generation of us, and even the younger still, we don't do that.
Right.
And
it's almost a lost
well, it is. PAF, I asked PAF, Jim Morrow and asked PAF, and Jerry Morris, Ian Lee, Bill Haskell, Paul Thompson, to write a little introductory piece for the first issue of the Journal of Physical Activity and Health. And so they obliged, and there's a sentence in there that goes something like, in today's society, unfortunately, many of us celebrate the elite athlete who performs for us when we should bring out the mundane athlete that we could all become. Now, if that's not poetic, I mean, it makes a point, but it says it in beautiful language, and I've always admired that about PAF's writing.
Yeah. Well, we've got about 5 minutes or so, and I just wondered if you may comment a little bit on sort of the acceptance of this kind of research into ACSM, and then in particular the acceptance of this kind of material, physical activity, particularly as a public health issue.
Right. I would go back even before Dr. Paffenbarger came to ACSM, there were some real pioneers in physical activity epidemiology who were past presidents and honor award winners, and I'm thinking particularly of Henry Montoy and Henry Taylor, who were also early in doing physical activity epidemiology studies. Dr. Taylor with the railroad workers, and Dr. Montoy with the Tecumseh Heart Study in Michigan. So there was a little foundation of epidemiology in ACSM in the 60s and early 70s, but there were very few people, not a lot at the meetings. But when Paff started coming in the 80s and bringing his actual very best work for presentations, topics that were later published in the New England Journal, for example, and then others started coming, and we could go down a long list of people who began to contribute. So there was a core of epidemiology that began to build up in the 1980s, and again, Paff was our leader in that.
Steve, just to interrupt you quickly, was ACSM the main forum for this by this time? In
I think
conferences and so forth? Or?
I think it became the main forum. Now, the Council on Epidemiology of American Heart, where Paff presented some of his work, and even the American Heart scientific sessions, and occasionally at the American Public Health Association or elsewhere. But I think during the 80s and the 90s, people like Paff and the Ilk of Worry and on down the list, people were bringing their very best work. And then Paff's student, Dr. Ai-Min Lee, who's simply one of the best there is of the current crop, brings her best work along with Paff. So it really became, over the last 20 years or so, I think, the place to go for physical activity epidemiology work.
And what did it take to, and I know you were instrumental in the Surgeon General's report on physical activity, what did it take to convince people to get to look at physical activity a different way, basically as a major public health issue?
Well, it goes back to the fundamental studies of Morris and Paffenbarger and Taylor and Montoy, that the evidence base began to build and became too compelling really to be ignored.
It any longer. Yeah.
And then I will put in a plug there for Dr. David Satcher, who was the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in the early 1990s. And he took the request to the Secretary of HHS that there be a Surgeon General's report on physical activity. So this arose out of the group at CDC, which was really started by Ken Powell and others who pushed it along. But Dr. Satcher took it to Washington and persuaded, again, the Secretary and others that it should be done. And then, of course, Dr. Satcher became one of our great Surgeon Generals a little bit after that. But I give David Satcher a lot of credit, because the Surgeon General's report brings a lot of credibility to the field that it addresses.
Yeah, I mean, like smoking in the 60s, I mean, it was a major milestone for that to happen.
Yeah.
And I can't believe it was 10 years ago. Well, anyhow, we're just about ready to wind up here. And
Good.
Paff, any other thoughts on the field, or where we're at, where we may go, what we need to do?
No. Well, we need a lot done in the next future. As being here in Denver, we've got to talk about the progress that has been made, that is underway, and that is to come along. I'm watching Steve Blair do all of it, and I'm in, and we don't have Marty Carvinen with us anymore, but a lot to be done, a lot to be said, a lot of fun ahead.
I agree. A lot of fun ahead. Yeah. A lot of new exciting topics to look at.
And a lot of new people.
Well, this is, talk about the growth of the field, and really the whole of exercise science. But certainly our area of physical activity and public health. There are just so many bright young people coming along now, being trained in departments like the University of South Carolina, which the exercise science department is actually in the School of Public Health.
Is that
and so
Russ
they blend.
Pate's
Yeah, that's
group?
Russ Pate's group. So they blend together, and Larry Durstein, our incoming president. But they blend together the very basic exercise physiology, the psychology and behavioral sciences. They have some top people there, and epidemiology. And they're really, along with others, are training the cadre of the next cadre, and they're brilliant young people. I mean, just yesterday talking to some about what they're doing here, and the symposium yesterday. It's exciting. The field is.
And the nice thing is, again, because of the record that you've outlined, those people are coming to ACSM.
Yeah.
And bringing their best.
Right.
That's right.
Which
It's a progressive
which
process.
says a lot for the groundwork that you two have done and explained to us.
But a new, or not new, but continuing for the future. I'll just make one last plug, and I know you're speaking next to our friend Professor Bill Morgan, who was, again, one of these pioneers in the area of bringing psychology and behavioral science into physical activity. And you can ask him this question, but did he have any dream 30 years ago that it would develop and burgeon the way it has now? Again, with so many bright young people around the country focusing on behavioral issues, how do you get sedentary people to become more active and stay more active? What are the effects of activity on various psychosocial outcomes? It's a new field. I mean, Bill has been around for quite a number of years, and his students, but I think it's one that's growing very rapidly, and we're going to see a lot of exciting stuff coming out of that in the future.
Yeah, there was a whole session on that. I think Rod Dishman is one of Bill's students.
Indeed.
And Salas from San Diego, and it's just, and you could take any of these so-called subfields or whatever and look at the same kind of growth and development.
Well, you mentioned Jim Salas, who is one of the leaders in the area of investigating the effect the environment has on physical activity habits. So we're bringing
children.
Yeah, right, and with children and families and communities. I mean, we're now seeing architects, city planners,
designing for,
people such as that actually coming to this meeting and getting involved in other exercise science meetings. So it is an exciting new area. There's plenty left to do, even after we go on.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for coming and chatting with us a little bit this morning. It was very nice of you to take your time.
Thank you.
We appreciate it very much.
It was a pleasure, Jack. Thanks.
We